Wow, good morning, everyone. You know, to answer Andy's question, I don't know what a dean of social media is either. Interesting story behind that job title. That job title was given to me by Phil Johnson, the executive director at Grace to You, and it's kind of funny. I didn't even become aware of that job title until it was maybe November, December 2018. I'm in Atlanta. I'm originally from Atlanta. Lived in LA the past 3 years. I went there to go work at Grace to You, but I wasn't aware of that job title until I got an email from Grace to You saying, "Okay, here's your job." And I saw at the top, Dean of Social Media. I'm like, what is that? So if you ever come to Valencia, California, and I invite you to come there, please stop by Grace to You. We'd love to give you a tour. But everyone else there on the management team is director of this, director of that, director of the other, but I'm dean. So it's like, but I do feel kind of special though. So we're going to keep it. We're going to keep that. Before I get into my message, just real quick, something that Andy said yesterday that he thought may have been somewhat innocuous, but I thought was very profound. And he's talking about within evangelicalism, we've got all these churches and leaders within these churches saying, "Hey, just preach Jesus. You just do the love. Everything's fine. Just preach Jesus. Everything's okay." But it just occurred to me, just sitting there listening to Andy, well, why do we preach Jesus? Because everything is not okay. When you think about it, everything's not okay. So even the folks who say, well, go ahead and preach Jesus, well, you need to check them on that. Why do I need to preach Jesus? Why do I need to preach anybody? I don't care who you are. Preach Buddha, preach Muhammad, preach whoever. Why is it need? Why is preaching needed? Because things are not okay. They're not okay when you think about it. All right. Andy, can I get my graphic up? Are we going to be able to do that? All right, there we go. Hey, you guys know who I am now. You know where I work, so we can get rid of that slide. So I asked Andy to. I texted Andy before arriving here. I said, "Hey, bro, can we put this graphic up?" I said, because this is perfect for what I want to talk about. And I said, I would like to leave it up there for the duration of my message. So thank you, Andy, for accommodating my request. I want to talk to you this morning about the interconnectedness of critical race theory and Marxism. The interconnectedness of critical race theory and Marxism. And when it comes to understanding critical race theory, what you and I must initially realize is that critical race theory, or CRT, is not some kind of Big Bang proposition. And what I mean by that is that critical race theory as a worldview is not a belief system that has come about ex nihilo. Okay? It's not something that just came out of nowhere. Critical race theory has a definitive genesis, and that genesis begins with a worldview that was originally advanced by two 19th century German philosophers whose names were Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883, and Friedrich Engels, who lived from 1820 to 1895. And that worldview is commonly, we've heard the term quite often already in the day and a half that we've been here, it's commonly referred to as Marxism. Now, critical race theorists will argue that CRT has nothing to do with Marxism. Well, I'm here to debunk that. That's a lie. There's an ideological umbilical cord, if you will, that inexorably connects critical race theory with Marxism. And that connection is a mutual disdain of and contempt for capitalism. Like Marxism, critical race theory views capitalism as the fundamental cause of racism in America. Now, I'm going to talk further about that in a second, but I have to sort of divert here. What Virgil and I do on the Just Thinking podcast is we break down words. We're an expository exegetical podcast. That's why our episodes are 2-3 hours long. But let's take the word racism, for example. Root word of racism is what? Race. Racism takes a noun, race, adds the suffix ism, which changes it from a noun to a verb. Now, why is that important? Because as Christians and as apologists, And every Christian is an apologist. The only question is, how bad an apologist are you? But when you take a noun, you add a suffix and it becomes a verb, then it becomes attitudinal and behavioral. It becomes dynamic. It's no longer static. And when you go from static to dynamic, you go from innocuous to attitudinal or behavioral or actionable. Then you're talking about the heart. That's what makes it a theological issue. Do you understand that? So what we have to do as Christians and as apologists, we need to be able to break down the language that's morphing every day and reframe that language and peel it back like an onion through what the scripture says. And scripture is totally sufficient for us to do that. We just have to know how. So in critical race theory, it views capitalism as the fundamental cause of racism in America. That's because in critical race theory, capitalism is what breeds white supremacy. And it's white supremacy that critical race theorists, or crits, as they're often referred to, purportedly desire to dismantle in society. So you're going to hear me use that term, crits. It's just a shortened version of critical race theorists, okay? Now, like Marxism, critical race theory is fundamentally a philosophy of class struggle, in which the oppression, injustice, and inequality of capitalism must be replaced with a more just, equitable, and inclusive system, namely socialism. Marxist professor Dr. Epifano San Juan Jr., and you're going to hear me quote him several times. The reason is because Dr. Epifano San Juan, he goes by a shorter version. He just calls himself Dr. E. San Juan. But Dr. Epifano San Juan Jr. is one of the few Marxist critical race theorists who is saying the quiet part out loud. So you're going to hear me quote him 3 or 4 times. But Dr. San Juan, he expresses this vision, this idea that capitalism is the blame, is the cause for all racism in America. He expresses that in a 2005 white paper published in the Michigan Journal of Race and Law, titled "From Race to Class Struggle, subtitled Reproblematizing Critical Race Theory." Do not lose sight of that word. That's what critical race theory does. It reproblematizes everything. And as Michael just alluded to, what we have to understand here is the word critical in critical race theory never means analytical. It means to criticize everything, to find fault with everything. This is why Dr. San Juan titled this paper that he did. You have to reproblematize everything. He says this, quote, "A study of racist practices and institutions." Now, before I go on, if you've, like Virgil and I have, if you've read source material from the crits themselves, what you're going to find is some of the most unintelligible gibberish that you've ever read. These are folks with PhDs from Ivy League institutions, but they make absolutely no sense. And that's on purpose because they're using these multisyllabic words to disinterest you, and hopefully you'll give up trying to understand what they're saying. So I have to put that caveat out there, because what you're about to hear is some of the most nonsensical sentences that I've ever come across. But this is what Dr. Epifano San Juan Jr. said in his paper, From Race to Class Struggle. Quote, "A study of racist practices and institutions divorced from the underlying determinant structure of capital accumulation and class rule, which allows such practices and institutions to exercise their naturalizing force, can only perpetuate an abstract metaphysics of race and a discourse of power that would reinforce the continuing reification or commodification of human relationships in everyday life." That's one sentence. He continues, "We cannot multiply static determinations in an atomistic manner and at the same time acquire an intelligible totality of knowledge which we need for formulating strategies of radical social transformation." Now, whenever you hear the phrase radical social transformation, just go ahead and translate that socialism. A first step in this project of renewing critical race. Now, please catch this. Here's where he starts getting a little clearer. His language gets a little more simplistic. A first step in this project of renewing critical race theory is simple to state, but difficult to execute. You begin with the concept of class as an antagonistic relation between labor and capital, and then proceed to analyze or criticize how the determinant of race, he has it in quotes, race is played out historically in the class conflicted structure of capitalism and its political and ideological processes of class rule, unquote. Again, that was Dr. Epiphanios San Juan from his paper, From Race to Class Struggle, Reproblematizing Critical Race Theory. Now, Dr. San Juan is unambiguously emphatic that in order for critical race theory to be most advantageous toward achieving the radical social transformation that he and others who share his worldview envision, that it must be posited in such a way as to mirror what is the fundamental idea upon which Marxism is built. And that is the idea of class as an antagonistic relation between labor and capital. In other words, the haves and the have-nots, or what Marx referred to as the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So how this translates to you who are sitting here listening to me right now, if you're white, you're privileged by virtue of existing. I'm oppressed by virtue of existing. It's class antagonism. So within critical race theory, everything is class. Everything. Is that same ideological interconnectedness that is expressed in a June 15th, 2020 article on the website Marxism.com titled USA, Black Struggle and the Socialist Revolution, which states this, quote, "The struggle against racism and discrimination is of crucial importance for revolutionary Marxists." Now, there's a redundancy right there. Have you ever known of a non-revolutionary Marxist? The struggle against racism and discrimination is of crucial importance for revolutionary Marxists. We fight at all times against all forms of oppression and discrimination, but we do this while fighting for maximum unity of the working class across, now here's the intersectionality, across lines of gender, race, ethnicity, and religion, always linking this to the struggle for the revolutionary socialist transformation of society. There's that phrase again. Revolutionary transformation. Who else did you hear use that term years ago? It's President Barack Obama. Fundamental transformation of America. Continuing to quote from Marxism.com, "There is no solution within the limits of capitalism." Don't miss that. There is no solution within the limits of capitalism. 2 weeks ago, Black Lives Matter from their official Twitter page said the exact same thing. Said capitalism is no friend to Black Americans. I don't know how many of you follow me on Twitter. You follow me at your own risk. Let me just say that. But I'm most active on Twitter than any other social platforms that I'm on. So I see this tweet from Black Lives Matter. And being the troublemaker that I am, I quote tweeted them. So if you don't know what a quote tweet is, you take what someone else tweeted, you can retweet it, but with your own commentary. Virgil and I are both historians, and one of the knocks that we get, being that we're reformed, we're Black, reformed, and conservative, is that we have no affinity for Black history. I mean, it's laughable. If you were to come visit my office at Grace Diuna and you just take a look at my library, I have more books on slavery in my library than any other topic, with the exception of theology. But I quote tweet Black Lives Matter. I'm like, okay, here's what you said. Capitalism is the enemy of Black Americans. So what do? I quote them, and in my quote, I include 9 names of Black American millionaires from the mid-1850s. See, that's how you fight this. You don't give them LeBron James. You don't give them Michael Jordan. You give them a history lesson. That shuts them up. There's no solution within the limits of capitalism. Here it is again, just like I quoted earlier from Dr. San Juan. It is above all a class question. And as always, we start with our general program. Our task as Marxists is to raise class unity, consciousness, and confidence. We do not fight only for immediate gains, but also to raise the perspective and potential for plenty of jobs, healthcare, housing, and education for all under socialism. We do not merely seek a more fair division of capitalist scarcity. United class struggle is the only way forward. As a super exploited section of the population, Black workers and youth will play a key role in the coming socialist revolution, unquote. Again, that was from Marxism.com, an article titled USA, Black Struggle and the Socialist Revolution. Now, the assertion there in that quote that it is above all a class question cannot be overemphasized because, like Marxism, critical race theory is fundamentally, again, a philosophy of class struggle. It is vitally important that you understand that. It's important because in critical race theory, race is fundamentally a social construct. It's a social construct. Critical race theory does not see or define race as a fixed, immutable, and static aspect of one's personality that is grounded in biology or science or, for that matter, theology, as we find in Acts chapter 17, verse 26. One of Virgil and I, my foundational text when we're either on our podcast or we're speaking somewhere to give a biblical definition of what culture calls race and what scripture calls ethnicity. Acts 17:26, I'm reading from the New American Standard Translation. And he, that is God, made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. Now, in that verse, that Greek word nation, it's not speaking of sovereign geographical boundaries. That word nation in the Greek is the Greek word ethnos, from where we get our English word ethnicity, ethnic. Here we are in New York City, arguably, especially from the standpoint of food diversity, there's no place like it on earth. No place like New York City if you're forgetting variances in types of food to eat. How many of you have ever been to a restaurant that specialized in racial cuisine? You get my point? But you have been to restaurants that specialize in what? Ethnic cuisine. Scripture answers all these questions, folks. The word isn't race, it's ethnicity. We are all one genus, one type, comprised of various ethnicities. Virgil and I did one of our earlier podcast episodes with one that we titled, you're going to laugh when you hear the title, but we were deadly serious, A Biblical Theology of Soul Food. If you're subscribed to the Just Thinking podcast, I encourage you to go back or go to justthinking.me, click the podcast link, and go back, scroll down, and listen to the episode. In that episode, we take you from Genesis 11 in the Tower of Babel, the diaspora, where God, in his judgment of the people, sends, it literally says this in Genesis 11. He sent all the peoples out to live on all the face of the earth. We use Genesis 11 to establish a hermeneutic of soul food. Why do you think you have Cuban ethnic cuisine? Indian. We had Indian. This is authentic Indian food. Yesterday, Italian. It's Genesis 11, which says the same thing that we just read in Acts 17:26. That he made from one man every ethnicity of mankind to live where? On all the face of the earth. This is why New York is what it is. It has a reputation it has for the different types of food that you can get here. It's Genesis 11. That critical race theory views race as a social construct is crucial to understand, because to understand that is to also understand why critical race theory, not unlike Marxism itself, emphasizes the deconstruction of social institutions and structures which purportedly exists to solely to oppress different classes of people, such as blacks. Now you've got Latinx, and have you seen the most recent, I may be out of date just standing here, but have you seen the most recent LGBTQ series of characters it's got the 2S at the end? Have you seen that? The number 2 and the letter S, that stands for people who identify as two-spirited. Two-spirited immigrants, transgenders, and various other intersectional categories of people whose oppression is firmly rooted in the greed and avarice of white supremacist capitalists. Race in CRT is exclusively, solely a social construct. Well, why is that important to know? See, it's important because viewing race, and please hear me clearly on this, viewing race as a biological or scientific reality and viewing racism as a spiritual problem rooted in the human condition as opposed to a subjective social construct doesn't achieve for critical race theorists the eschatological utopia that they want to bring about in the world. See, in other words, what I'm saying here is that critical race theorists, they cannot afford to view the ism of racism as a heart problem, because that doesn't get them what they want. This is why I'm saying that I argue that critical race theory is eschatological. From the Greek word eschaton speaks of the end times. We said, what you have to understand about eschatology. Eschatology is not only the end of something, it's the beginning of something else. This is what critical race theorists want. One, that's why their worldview is eschatological. And it is a worldview. It's an entire worldview. Again, that's why I argue that CRT is an all-encompassing worldview. And I say that in light, again, I want to quote Dr. Epifiano San Juan. In a 2000 white paper published in the Michigan Journal of Race and Law, again, same paper, From Race to Class Struggle, Reproblematizing Critical Race Theory, Dr. San Juan says this, and like I said, he's saying the quiet part out loud right here from the very first sentence. Quote, "We need to reinstate the Marxist category of class." That's the quiet part out loud that crits don't want you to know. Here he says two things. He's saying what the goal is, and he's also acknowledging that that classism, dividing people up into class, originates within Marxism. We need to reinstate the Marxist category of class, derived from the social division of labor that generates antagonistic class relations. So the goal is to generate antagonistic class relations between the classes. Black versus white. Class conflict becomes the key to grasping the totality of social relations of production, as well as the metabolic process of social reproduction in which racism finds its effectivity. This will help us clarify the changing modes of racist practices, especially in global market operations where immigrant female labor plays a decisive role. I use the example of Filipino domestics as a global social class actualized in its specific historical particularity as gendered, neo-colonized subjects of capital accumulation. Let me pause right there. So what Dr. San Juan is doing here, he just subjectively takes Filipino domestics and groups them as a social class, not an employment class, not an economic class. They're a social class. And he just groups them arbitrarily as a social class. And then what he does is he looks at their occupation up against a Marxist idea of neocolonialism. So the Filipino domestic is a domestic because capitalism oppressed them. They had no choice but to go into that line of work. But Dr. Epifanio San Juan closes with this. He says, critical race theory can be renewed by adopting class struggle as the means of resolving racial injustice through radical structural transformation. That's the third time I've used that phrase. End quote. Now, please note that such wording as antagonistic class relations, class conflict, and radical structural transformation is classic Marxist vernacular. And that vernacular accurately captures the teleology of critical race theory, which is to pit various classes of people against one another, particularly with regard to any socioeconomic distinctions that may exist between those classes, for the sole purpose of fostering, like Dr. San Juan said, antagonistic class relations toward the ultimate goal of radical structural transformation. And that goal is precisely why statistics, particularly certain socio-ethnic economic data, are such valuable weapons for crits. Crits are quick to throw up statistics. They use statistics as a means to form and propagate the misleading narrative. Now listen to me closely here. Crits use statistics to propagate the misleading narrative that any socioeconomic differences that may exist, particularly between blacks and whites in America, are actually disparities. And that those disparities are solely the direct result of inequities brought about in society by an oppressive capitalistic system that is grounded in white hegemony. A prime example of this, a prime example of the kind of subjective narratology that I'm talking about, where critics use statistics subjectively, can be found in a book which perhaps many of you have read. It's titled Divided by Faith, by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith, published more than 20 years ago. It's a book full of stats. Well, whites make this much money, blacks make this much money. Whites live in these zip codes, blacks live in these zip codes. So they subjectively use statistical data to present differences as disparities. But you see, to view something as a disparity, which in reality is merely a difference or a distinction, presupposes the existence of a universal standard of material equality wherein each of us starts out in life with the same type and amount of stuff. Now, let me ask you a question. The difference between where I am and where you're sitting, is that a disparity? See, it's only a disparity if you're supposed to be up here too. Do you understand what I'm saying here? It's like Michael said, you have to mock what these people stand for. Well, there's a difference in where I am and where you're sitting, but that's not a disparity. Again, disparity presupposes a universal standard of equality. We're not equal right now. I'm speaking, you're not. So to view something as a disparity, which is really just a difference, you need to be able to catch these things. So what I'm trying to say here is that not every difference is a disparity. Some differences are just that. They're differences. Rightly did Thomas Sowell say in his book, Discrimination and Disparities, quote, "The crucial question is not whether evils exist, but whether the evils of the past or present are automatically the cause of any major economic, educational, and other social disparities today." See, this is what the critics will argue. Slavery. I mean, I have to laugh because when they try to bring up slavery, and I'm not finished with the Sowell quote, but what he says here, he says the crucial question is not whether evils exist, but whether those evils automatically are the cause. So you have what's her name from the 1619 Project? Yeah. What's her name again, Michael? Hannah Nicole. Slavery, 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 slavery. 1619, 1619, 1619. She questioned some white guy. So I felt sorry for him because he didn't know. Do you know what the white lion was? She asked. He didn't know. I wish she'd asked me. Yeah, I know what the white lion was. The White Lion was the name of the slave ship that brought the first African slaves over to Jamestown, Virginia, that landed on North American soil in 1619. But see, one fundamental problem with the 1619 Project is that it treats black people as sinless in the slave trade. Y'all want me to go there? I told you I've studied more about slavery than any other topic, with the exception of theology. See, what we need is a 1618 project that goes before 1619 to educate people on what happened leading up to 1619. Because there'd been no 1619 if it weren't for people who look like me. If it weren't for people who look like me, there would have been no 1619 Jamestown, Virginia. I stand before you right now as a descendant of black African slave owners. My paternal roots go all the way back to the Guinea-Bissau tribe in Guinea-Bissau, West Africa. The Balanta people. The Balanta were rice farmers. They were rice harvesters. The Balanta willingly, volitionally engaged with the Portuguese for profit to sell and trade not only their own, their enemies, their tribal enemies, but also their own people in exchange for farming tools and farming knowledge, which would make their rice harvest more productive and make them more wealthy. So you cannot have a conversation about slavery in America. You cannot have an intellectually honest conversation about slavery in America without going before 1619. Do you know if you were to trace the actual number of slaves that came out of Africa, out of the continent of Africa, where North America, and I say North America because when people say, well, people are quick to say, well, America's guilty of 400 years of slavery. America's not even 400 years old. So I distinguish between America, the United States, and North America. Okay, so slave trade, we're talking early to mid 1500s. Sure, there were African slaves transported out of Africa to North American shores. But do you know if you list the top 10 nations that participated in the transatlantic slave trade, where would America rank? Number 9. Right before the Baltic states. The number 1 country in terms of numbers of slaves that were deported from Africa is Brazil. The U.S. is way down there. But what do you hear the 1619 Project talking about? They treated America as if America is the most guilty. Now, as Christians, we take a theological view of slavery. We do not take a social or an anthropological view of slavery. Slavery is rooted in Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. But see, the 1619 Project, why would you want to start at 1619 as if black people had nothing to do with this? To continue with Dr. Sowell's quote, he says, the bedrock assumption underlying many political or ideological crusades is that socioeconomic disparities are automatically somebody's fault, so that our choices are either to blame society or blame the victim. Discrimination as an explanation of economic and social disparities, which is exactly the only reason crits give for economic differences, is discrimination. Discrimination as an explanation of economic and social disparities may have a similar emotional appeal for many, but we can at least try to treat these and other theories as testable hypotheses. The historic consequences of treating particular beliefs as sacred dogmas beyond the reach of evidence or logic should be enough to dissuade us from going down that road again, despite how exciting or emotionally satisfying political dogmas and the crusades resulting from those dogmas can be, or how convenient in sparing us the drudgery and discomfort of having to think through our own beliefs or test them against facts, unquote. See, this is what crits would hope you do. If you look at the mainstream media, what they try to do is get the angriest looking, the meanest looking black people on the air that they can find, because they think that these people speak on behalf of all black people. You look at crits, they're the most unhappy, lonely, angry, hopeless people you can run into. They don't want you to think through what they're saying. This idea of socioeconomic equality, particularly as that idea is framed within a Marxian paradigm of what equality should look like, is precisely, again, why Dr. Epiphanius San Juan Jr. can make such nonsensical statements as the one I'm about to quote to you, which is from an article he wrote titled The Limits of Post-Colonial Criticism, subtitled The Discourse of Edward Said, in which Dr. San Juan said this. See, I warned you earlier about this, some of the nonsensical stuff that these people say. These people who have PhDs, this is unbelievable. San Juan said this, quote, capital ethnicizes people to promote labor segmentation, hybridity, and other differential phenomena result, unquote. Capital ethnicizes people. Anybody want to explain that to me? How does capital ethnicize someone? In other words, according to Dr. San Juan, at least, it is capitalism that is solely responsible for any societal acrimony that exists in America today, particularly between blacks and whites. And by the way, it may interest you to know that neither socialism nor Marxism, for that matter, as ideological roadmaps to societal equality and social justice, are foreign to black civil rights in America. Socialism and Marxism, as it relates to black civil rights history in America, they're bedfellows. Let me give you an example. In a speech delivered to a group of striking railroad workers on July 27, 1877, a black socialist by the name of Peter Humphreys Clark, who at that time was principal of the colored high school in Cincinnati, Ohio, and was grandson of William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, said this, quote, the government must control capital with a strong hand. It is merely the accumulated results of industry, and there would be no justice should a few scorbees in the hive take possession of the store of honey and dole it out to the workers in return for their services, which added to their superabundant store. He's making the same argument that Karl Marx did. Yet such is the custom of society. Machinery and land will, in time, take the same course, and cooperation instead of competition will be the new law of society. That's just another way of saying socialism. Socialism is going to replace capitalism. The miserable condition into which society has fallen has but one remedy, and that remedy is to be found in socialism, unquote. That was Peter Humphreys Clark, a black socialist from 1877. Another example is labor activist and politician A. Philip Randolph. Asa Philip Randolph, who lived from 1889 to 1979. Now, Randolph is one of the most significant yet least recognized leaders of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Though Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is widely lauded for his I Have a Dream speech delivered at the March on Washington in August 1963, it was A. Philip Randolph who played an integral role in organizing that event to begin with. In chapter 10 of a book titled Workers' Struggles, subtitled Past and Present, by Manning Marable, titled A. Philip Randolph and the Foundations of Black American Socialism, Marable writes this, quote, Randolph's personal background conformed in most respects to that of other first-generation black immigrants from the South. Born in Crescent City, Florida in 1889, he grew up in Jacksonville during the nadir of black-white relations. Inspired as a teenager by W.E.B. Du Bois's book, Souls of Black Folks, young Asa decided to leave the South and settle in New York City. Arriving in Harlem in the spring of 1911, Randolph first tried to become an actor. Failing at this, he drifted from one job to another. From 1912 to 1917, he attended courses at the City College of New York. A leftist philosophy professor, J. Salwin Shapiro, acquainted Randolph with Karl Marx's writings and other socialist literature. Randolph's discovery of socialism was so, quote, exciting, unquote. He later reflected that he studied, quote, Marx as children read Alice in Wonderland, unquote. He formed a group of radical free thinkers called the Independent Political Council and began to identify himself with Harlem's premier black socialist and leading street corner orator, Hubert Harrison. No relation, by the way. Randolph joined the Socialist Party in the end of 1916 and began to lecture on black history and political economy at the Socialist Party's Rand School. By the beginning of World War I, Randolph and his new black friend, Chandler Owen, a fellow socialist, had become, quote, the most notorious street corner radicals in Harlem, exceeding even Harrison in the boldness of their assault upon political and racial conditions in the country, unquote. What I'm trying to establish for you here is that the relationship between black civil rights movement and social justice movement are not foreign to socialism and Marxism. Socialism and Marxism as ideologies have been integral to black civil rights in this country. This is nothing new. But speaking of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a Pan-Africanist, by the way, he is particularly admired by critical race theorists today because of his emphasis on black power and autonomy. As Marxist professor Raylan Rabaka, director of the Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, writes in Chapter 5 of the Handbook of Critical Race Theory and Education, titled W.E.B. Du Bois's Contributions to Critical Race Studies and Education, Professor Rabaka says this, quote, Du Bois's sociology of education involves not only the reclamation of African historical memory in the interest of radically re-educating critical educators and students about Africa's creation of and contributions to civilization, but also a struggle, listen to this, but also a struggle over the meaning of culture and cultural meanings. Let me pause here. This is the goal of critical race theory in schools, is to redefine the meaning of culture and cultural meanings. Critical race theory has nothing to do about teaching history. I'm going to talk about that later. It's a worldview. It wants to change your worldview and that of your children. In order to, continuing with Dr. Rabaka's quote, in order to resist the imperialist impulse, and anytime you hear that word imperialist, that's classic Marxist vernacular, someone who's against capitalism. Any capitalist is an imperialist. If you have a job, you're an imperialist. In order to resist the imperialist impulse, continental and diasporan Africans, along with other oppressed people, must do more than merely rediscover their long-hidden history. They are obliged to also critically, and what do we say that word means? Is criticize. They're also obliged to criticize and critically return to the source of their history, which is their culture, the distinct thought and practice traditions that they have developed to sustain and enhance their life worlds and lived experiences. Okay, so what critical race theory wants to do, especially in the realm of education, is to retrain especially black children to detach themselves from Western Judeo-Christian values and exchange those for diasporan African cultural values, which include, by the way, African spiritualism. This is why Virgil and I did an entire episode. We titled it The Church of Black Lives Matter. And we took you through the African spiritualism that undergirds that organization. It's dangerous. For Du Bois, Rabaka continues, for Du Bois, capitalism and racism, as with capitalism and sexism. See, again, within critical race theory, capitalism is to blame for everything. Everything. Capitalism and racism, as with capitalism and sexism, are inextricable and constantly influencing and exacerbating each other. They are interlocking systems of exploitation, oppression, and violence that conceal a kind of cultural racism deeply embedded in the languages and logic, mores and twisted morals, institutions, and individual imperialist expressions of the ruling race, gender, class, religion, and its neo-colonized colored lackeys, unquote. Now, let me try to deconstruct this for a second. What Rabaka is saying here, when he says that that capitalism is a kind of cultural racism that's deeply embedded in the languages and logic and mores and twisted morals, et cetera, are any of you familiar with, it's been a few months now, but the National African American History Museum produced an infographic. Work is racist. Punctuality is racist. Using proper grammar is racist. You guys remember that? Well, if you're familiar with the Just Thinking podcast, Virgil and I did an entire episode where we went through that infographic one item at a time. This is what Rabaka is talking about. He's saying those language, mores, the mores, like being on time for work, that's a more. That's a racist more that needs to change. This is why math is now racist. This is what Rabaka is talking about. See, this is why in critical race theory, education, for lack of a better word, is cultural. It's not academic anymore. Matter of fact, there's a movement right now among Marxist, socialist, critical race theory teachers in public school to replace the term critical race theory. Yeah, it's SEL, but under SEL, what they're using another CRT word, culturally relevant teaching. It's still CRT, folks. It's still critical race theory. Trust me. But what Rabaka is talking about here, this is why using proper grammar is racist. No, we need to bring our black children back to their African diasporan roots, where they used broken English. They didn't even speak English, but to whatever degree they did, it was broken English, and that should be fine. You know, when you look at people like Rabaka, I've studied ad nauseum the black abolitionists of the 19th century. Many of them, and I would argue perhaps the vast majority of them post-Reconstruction became teachers. They became educators. Booker T. Washington was an educator. Frederick Douglass was an educator. Lucy Laney was an educator. And when you go back and you read them, what they wanted was equal treatment. They didn't want special treatment. They wanted, if you read Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, there's a reason he called it up from slavery, not down. Washington thought this about himself, and he thought this about every black person, that education was the way up. He didn't lower the bar, but see what critical race theory does, it not only lowers the bar, it gets rid of any bar. By the way, that phrase, the neo-colonized colored lackeys, that I ended this Rabaka quote with, that's actually an ethnic pejorative that is directed toward black people like me and black people like Virgil, who happen to not embrace his Pan-Africanist, his Afrocentric worldview. So we're neo-colonized colored lackeys, because we just carried the water of the white colonialists. We've been called white supremacists, by the way. But if you listen to our Just Thinking podcast episode titled Whiteness, you'll understand why. We give you a very simple definition of what whiteness is. You ready for it? Whiteness is anything that's not blackness. That's what whiteness is. Simple definition. Whiteness is anything that's not blackness. Contrary to what may seem to be the reality on the sociocultural surface, not all black people view socialism and Marxism with such tribalistic endearment. For example, Dr. Chui Mbetwa sees socialism quite differently than Dr. Rabaka does, as he asserts in his book titled Why Africa is Poor. Dr. Chui Mbetwa says this, quote, "Socialism is not adept at finding solutions to serious problems. Its emphasis on collective responsibility over and above individual responsibility rolls over lingering individual capacity to configure self-extricating measures out of crises. In the long term, socialism robs individuals of the opportunity to acquire skills for personal emancipation." I love that phrase, personal emancipation. That's what Booker T. Washington was all about. Socialism struggles, Dr. Mbetwa says, socialism struggles when it attempts to function as a propeller of wealth, unquote. And that's one of the ironies about socialism. You need capitalism in order for socialism to work. And yet socialism is staunchly anti-capitalism. But it's like Dr. Mbetwa says here, though, socialism it attempts to function as a propeller of wealth. Well, where do you get the wealth from? Now, socialists steal it. Capitalists earn it. Capitalists, for the most part, earn it. But there's no socialist who earns it. Socialism steals. Now, I've spoken to this point about the ideological connections between critical race theory and Marxism. But there's a chronological connection as well, which I alluded to earlier, and that chronology begins with what is known as critical theory, or CT. Critical theory, and Michael gave an amazing walkthrough of the genesis of this, but I want to just go back. Critical theory provides a specific interpretation of Marxist philosophy with regard to critique of mass culture, or a criticism of mass culture. And when I say mass culture, I mean everything. Also known as the Frankfurt School, critical theory is a philosophical and sociological movement spread across many universities around the world. It was originally located at the Institute for Social Research at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany, hence the term Frankfurt School. The institute was founded in 1923 by a wealthy German Argentine by the name of Felix Weil, that's W-E-I-L, with the aim of developing Marxist studies in Germany. However, after 1933, these guys called the Nazis came in and forced the closure of the Institute for Social Research, and it was moved to the United States, where it found hospitality, of all places, right here in New York City at Columbia University. The Institute for Social Research still exists today. If you go on the Columbia University website, they've expanded the name for the Institute of Economic blah, 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 but it's the same thing. By the way, let me say this. Columbia University is no stranger to chaperoning communism. They have a long history of that at Columbia. Just go ahead and do a Google Columbia University communism and you'll get any number of hits. It is the Institute for Social Research which several decades later in the 1970s gave rise to a movement known as Critical Legal Studies, or CLS. So we go from CT to CLS. As a movement, CLS was comprised predominantly of white neo-Marxist legal scholars who sought to study the impacts of legal jurisprudence in America, but through a Marxian construct of equality and justice. It was the CLS movement that initiated a shift. Now hear me here. It was the CLS movement that has initiated a shift from Marxism being fundamentally a philosophy of economic class struggle to one of identity class struggle, which I choose to refer to as cultural Marxism or identity Marxism. So from the CLS movement in the 1970s arose what is known today as critical race theory, or CRT. Similar to the CLS movement, the CRT movement began with a group of black neo-Marxist legal scholars who met at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the summer of 1989 with the belief that their predecessors in the critical legal studies movement didn't move the dial far enough to the left for black people in America in terms of social justice. In other words, the CRT movement did not view the CLS movement as radical enough. The CLS movement was fine with the settled case law, such as Brown versus Board of Education. They were fine with the Civil Rights Act. They were fine with the Voting Rights Act. They were fine that redlining had been done away with. CRT said, no, we got to re-problematize these things. So what you'll find in critical race theory narratology is that what they're doing is reaching back in history to find what was a problem, and they're creating a narrative around that to have you believe that it's still a problem today. That's why the slavery narrative won't die. It just won't go away. As Dr. Daniel Subotnick, professor of law at Touro College of Law in Central Islip, New York, and author of the book Toxic Diversity, subtitled Race, Gender, and Law Talk in America, writes in a white paper published in the Cornell University Journal of Law and Public Policy in the spring of 1998 titled, What's Wrong with Critical Race Theory, subtitled Reopening the Case for Middle Class Values. Dr. Subotnick says this, quote, this is incredibly important to remember. With control of race discourse in their hands, crits turn their attention away from the legal academy and toward American culture in general. And this they have done with enthusiasm, developing and then applying new methods for the purpose and scouring the broad landscape of American life. They have found race and racism implicated in a terrifying array of institutions and practices. Whites then stand accused and have remained largely undefended, unquote. Two things here. When Subotnick says that crits have found race and racism implicated in a terrifying array of institutions and practices, he's not saying that they found evidence of racism in these institutions. He's saying that they are projecting racism, that there's racism in these institutions and practices. This is what I said again. You have to understand that the word critical does not mean analytical. So Subotnick is not saying that they did an objective analysis and found evidence, objective evidence of racism as a practice in these institutions. They're just presupposing that it's there. And you white people, it's there because of you white people. So he says this white people stand accused, but you don't have anyone to defend yourself, to defend you. So you're guilty by virtue of existing. Critical race theory is built upon one main presupposition, one primary presuppositional thesis, and that is supported by at least three subordinate yet equally important presuppositional theses. Michael touched on this in his remarks earlier. The main presuppositional thesis of critical race theory is that racism is the normal, common, and everyday experience of all people of color in America. Again, implicit in that presupposition is that only black people are holy and only white people are guilty. That is the foundational presupposition upon which critical race theory rests, that racism is the normal, embedded, everyday experience of people of color in America. The UCLA School of Public Affairs and Critical Race Studies lays out that thesis in more detail on its website, stating this, quote, CRT recognizes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of the American society. The individual, some more nonsense. I laugh every time I come across this. Listen to this. So in the first sentence, they're acknowledging that CRT is ingrained in the fabric and system of the American society. But listen to this. The individual racist need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture. Now, how can you, on the one hand, argue that racism exists in the dominant culture, but then at the same time say that the individual racists need not exist? This is why I say critical race theory is not some big bang philosophy. And yet they're saying here that racism just exists as if it just, boom, just out of nowhere. There it is. You can have racism without there being racist. Continuing with the UCLA Public School of Affairs and Critical Race Studies, this is the analytical lens that CRT uses in examining existing power structures. CRT identifies that these power structures are based on white privilege and white supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color, unquote. Now, let's talk about marginalization of people of color for a second. Virgil and I, we've only known each other for 4 years, but we've walked some of the same roads by God's providence. One of those roads is that we've pretty much been called every ethnic pejorative in the book. I mean, you name it, we've been called it. But when you talk about marginalization of people of color, it's usually people of color who marginalize me. I've never had a white person call me coon. Never had a white person call me nigger. Never had a white person call me Uncle Tom. Never had a white person call me Sambo, Quimbo. Never. I've been held up at gunpoint twice in my life, both times by a black person. So if you want to talk about marginalization of people of color, let's start with people of color. But see, in critical race theory, black people aren't sinners. We're holy by virtue of melanin. It doesn't get to the heart. So that's the main presuppositional thesis of CRT. Race is endemic to every aspect of American life. That is the primary thesis upon which critical race theory makes its money. Now, I don't use the phrase "makes its money" lightly. Virgil and I have said this for months, if not years, that we've known each other. Racism is a big business. What they call anti-racism is big business. But anti-racism is inherently racist. People like Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo are making millions of dollars. How to Raise an Anti-Racist Baby is Ibram Kendi's book. How to Be Anti-Racist, Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, Divided by Faith, all these books on racism. These people are getting wealthy. Ibram X. Kendi reportedly charges $20,000 per speaking engagement. I read recently, I think he was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He just got $40,000 for that. Now, in case you're wondering, Virgil and I don't get $40,000. nor 20 for that matter. But if you like to write a check, we don't get that. My point is this, is that for these crits who are so staunchly against capitalism, they're capitalizing. I want to quote again Dr. Daniel Subotnick from his book, Toxic Diversity. He says this, quote, if race is central because racial supremacy is central to American culture, which is precisely what crits argue. I just said that. That's the primary presuppositional thesis upon which CRT is built, that racism is central to American culture. Then all features, Dr. Subotnick says, then all features of American culture are presumed tainted. In such an environment, racism can be presumed and need not be proved, unquote. Dr. Subotnick nails it. This is how crits make their money. All they have to do is say something is racist. They don't have to prove it. They don't even have to prove it. Now, having given you the main presupposition of critical race theory that racism is essentially everywhere in society, I mean, let me just pause here and say this. You hear a lot about systemic racism. That term is thrown about like, well, think about it. See, we call our podcast Just Thinking for a reason. We challenge you to think. Look at, by definition, what does the word systemic mean? The word systemic, by definition, means it's everywhere. That's an objective definition. That's not Darrell's definition. Look in Webster's, you'll see that. Systemic means it's everywhere. If you have, for instance, someone who's dealing with cancer, the cancer has spread, it's metastasized. It may have begun in a local place, but it's metastasized now to where it's everywhere. It's terminal. That's systemic. But as long as it's local, it's not yet systemic. It's not systemic. Jim Crow was not universal. It wasn't systemic. Jim Crow was pretty much exclusively in the South. There wasn't Jim Crow in Washington State. And you know what? Something interesting about slavery again, before I leave this. Do you know that slavery was first legalized in the North? Slavery was first made law in northern states. It was the southern states who benefited economically from it because they were already so far behind the North in education and economics. They needed that labor. The North didn't need that labor. Now, the slavery was legal in the North, but it wasn't nearly at the level in terms of practice as it was in the South. But it was northern states who legislated slavery to be legal first. Southern states followed years after that. But understand that systemic, by definition, is that it's everywhere. So if there exists systemic racism, Virgil and I wouldn't even be able to be here today. We would, if racism was systemic, I would not have been able to buy an airline ticket to get here. I wouldn't have been able to check my bags because the gate agent was white. And thereby racist because she's white. So I couldn't have gotten an Uber. My Uber driver was white. My Uber driver pulls up. He sees that I'm black. He keeps going. You have to mock this stuff. But before you can mock it, you have to exegete it. You have to break down their vernacular for what it is, which is empty. It's empty words. Okay, having given you the main presupposition of critical race theory, there are at least 3 supporting presuppositional theses that support that main presupposition. I said at least 3, okay? Number 1 is what's called interest convergence or material determinism. Interest convergence or material determinism. That thesis holds that racism benefits and advances the interests of white people always and only at the expense of black people. Interest convergence theory, or material determinism. That's a term created by Derek Bell, the father of critical race theory. Number 2, the social construction thesis. The social construction thesis holds that race and races are products of social thought and relation, not fixed biological or scientific realities. That's the same belief that Karl Marx held. Karl Marx, who was a racist, by the way, a Jew who hated Jews. He hated his own ethnic tribe. Thirdly, is what's called the voice of color thesis, or the VOC thesis. The VOC thesis holds that ethnic minorities are better suited to talk about systemic oppression and marginalization. So in other words, if you're white, you have no right to say anything because you're the problem. So under the voice of color thesis in CRT, if you're white, you just need to shut up and listen. Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic, two of today's most influential critical race theorists, acknowledge that, quote, and I'm quoting here, critical race theory builds upon the insights of two previous movements, critical legal studies and radical feminism, to both of which it owes a large debt. It also draws from certain European philosophers and theorists such as Antonio Gramsci, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida, unquote. Now, what I want you to understand is that in Delgado and Stefancic saying that, and them crediting Gramsci, Foucault, and Derrida as certain European philosophers and theorists, what they don't tell you is that all three of those individuals were Marxists. In fact, Antonio Gramsci is widely regarded today as the godfather of cultural Marxism. So understand that in Delgado and Stefancic's book, Critical Race Theory and Introduction, they're crediting European philosophers and theorists who were actually Marxists. In the book, The Devil and Karl Marx, Dr. Paul Kengor, professor of political science at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania, makes the following astute assessment of today's culture against the backdrop of Marxism in the chapter titled Fundamental Transformation, in which he writes this. Please listen closely to this quote. Quoting Dr. Paul Kengor from his book, The Devil and Karl Marx. In a crucial respect, classical Marxism and cultural Marxism will always bear an essential, enduring commonality, one that explains a lot about today's modern left. Both classical Marxists and cultural Marxists see history as a series of struggles that divide the world into hostile and antagonistic groups of oppressors and the oppressed. Both seek out victim groups as the anointed group that will also serve as society's redeemer group. The victim group becomes the agent for emancipation in ushering in the new and better world, which is why I said CRT is eschatological. The victim group becomes the agent for emancipation and ushering in the new and better world. The Marxists must always then be on the search for the newest victim class, which in turn must always be made aware of its victimization. I'm not done yet, but that's what critical race theory does. See, they put you in the classes and you have to out-oppress one another. Its consciousness must be raised. That is, the consciousness of the victim class must be raised. In classical Marxism, this was simple. The victim group was identified by class economics. It was the proletariat. It was the factory worker. In cultural Marxism, this has not been so simple because the culture is always changing. That's why race is a social construct, because they get to change things. They get to manipulate it that way. The victim group is constantly being searched for anew by the cultural Marxists. They are looking less for factory workers than cultural workers. Forget the factory floor. That project failed long ago. The new recruiting ground is the classroom floor, the campus, the university, the schools. That is where the cultural workers who can usher in the fundamental transformation are being sought and being found. These modern cultural revolutionaries are succeeding magnificently in redefining everything from marriage and family to sexuality and gender. This is where today's Marxists in America and the West are toiling hard. They are working diligently on the cultural front. That is where they are confident that they can finally take down the West and its Judeo-Christian bedrock that Marx and a long line of disciples looked to smash, unquote. Now, critical race theory is unbiblical for at least the following 5 reasons. I'm a good Calvinist, so I'm going to give you 5 reasons. Critical race theory is unbiblical for at least the following 5 reasons. Number 1, it categorizes image bearers of God into groups for the purpose of causing division and antagonistic class struggle. That's antithetical to Genesis 1:27, Genesis 5:2, and Titus 3, verses 10 and 11. Number 2, it imparts sinful motives to certain of God's image bearers solely on the basis of the color of their skin. That's Acts 17:26. Number 3, CRT transfers the guilt of presumed sins of those from past generations to those of present generations. That's what I call sin by proxy. So that's what I mean when I say if you're white, you're guilty by virtue of existing because your ancestors all owned slaves. That's the only sin your ancestors ever committed was owning slaves. And I know they own slaves because you're white. Number 4, critical race theory is rooted in the sin of ethnic partiality. That's a violation of James chapter 2, verse 9. And then lastly, number 5, critical race theory promotes a materialistic covetousness and envy under the false pretense of justice and equity. I need my phone. I need to verb. Sorry, Andy. I need my phone. Real quick, a word about equity versus equality, because I think that's an important point for us to understand. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24. Equity and equality in one verse. The Apostle Paul says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run?" That's equality. We all run, but only one receives the prize. That's equity. See, critical race theory says equality is where everyone receives the prize. 1 Corinthians 9:24, there it is. The distinction between equity and equality in one verse. Old Testament example, 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon is adjudicating the situation with the 2 women who say the baby is theirs. What does he do? He threatens to cut the baby in half. Equality. Each of them would have had half a dead baby. But see, Solomon judged with equity. See, equity, the outcome is based on the truth. What is true? Only one woman left there with the baby. The other one didn't. That's equity. We don't all get the same thing. We're not all contrary to what the narrative is. None of us has a right to the same opportunities. No, we don't. You have a right to what you put into the opportunities that you do have, because you create that right. Thanks, B. I just want to make that point. If you're ever in a conversation with someone about equity and equality, just understand, number one, they're not the same thing. And there's one verse that you can knock that out in 30 seconds. 1 Corinthians 9:24. There it is. Now, there's much more about critical race theory that I wanted to share with you, but in the interest of time, I'm going to close here. But as I close, I want to share with you this account from the book Jesus in Beijing by David Aikman, rather. Jesus in Beijing is the book. And I want to quote him because I think his words here provide some much needed context in light of what I've shared with you today, especially in terms of the influence of Marxism on critical race theory and its disdain for capitalism. Okay. Quoting Dr. David Aikman from his book, Jesus in Beijing. The 18 American tourists visiting China weren't expecting much from the evening's scheduled lecture. They were already exhausted from a day of touring Beijing, but what the speaker had to say astonished them. Quote, one of the things we were asked to look into was what accounted for the success, in fact, the preeminence of the West all over the world, he said. We studied everything we could from the historical, political, economic, and cultural perspective. At first, we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we had. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. Next, we focused on your economic system. But in the past 20 years, we have realized that the heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity. That is why the West has been so powerful. The Christian moral foundation in social and cultural life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. We don't have any doubt about this. Unquote. So is critical race theory compatible with Christianity? Let me answer that question by reading to you a passage from an article titled Christianity or Critical Theory by Dr. Eric B. Watson, senior pastor of Harvest Orthodox Presbyterian Church in San Marcos, California. The quote that I'm about to cite, by the way, is taken from an article that's published in the October 2021 issue of Table Talk magazine from Ligonier Ministries. But Dr. Watkins writes this, quote, is critical race theory's worldview compatible with Christianity? This is an important question. While it may be possible to find Christians who endorse critical theory, it is nearly impossible to find critical theorists who endorse Christianity. This is because Christianity is an overarching system of thought that seeks to define reality and posits objective moral values. Critical race theory is entirely subjective. It's entirely subjective. According to critical theory, still quoting Dr. Watkins, Christianity fosters unsafe ideologies and institutions that perpetuate anti-scientific thought, intolerance for certain sexual behaviors, parochialism, patriarchy, and a punishing authoritarianism for any who do not conform. Pre-Enlightenment Christianity is seen as stuck in the dark ages of intellectual barbarism, and the post-Enlightenment church is viewed as perpetuating colonialism, racism, sexism, chauvinism, and homophobia. Critical theory is critical of virtually all worldviews, including Christianity. Its goal, listen to this, its goal is human autonomy from any objective authority whatsoever, unquote. Dr. Eric Watson, again, that's in the October 2021 issue of Table Talk magazine. Now, contrary to what many Marxist critics, Black liberation theologians would have you believe, critical race theory is not merely some innocuous, innocent way of promoting anti-racism or of teaching people about the history of racism in America or of understanding how the power dynamics of white supremacy have operated in this nation. Let me leave you with this hammer quote. This is from Teresa Montano. Teresa Montano is a teacher, public school teacher, and a Marxist. She's part of a group called Liberated Ethnic Studies. Ethnic studies is one of the surreptitious ways that critical race theory is taught in public schools. And Virgil and I tell people everywhere we go, critical race theory is a very stealth ideology. No crit is going to tell you, yeah, we're teaching critical race theory. I know here in New York, your public school have numbers, PS 55. Yeah, we're teaching critical race theory at PS 55. They're not going to call it critical race theory. They're going to call it something like ethnic studies. They're going to call it something like social emotional learning. They're going to call it something, cultural relevant teaching is what they're going to call it. But regardless of what they call it, please understand that it's still critical race theory. Listen to Teresa Montano. Quote, ethnic studies is more than pedagogy and content. Ethnic studies is about creating change in the community. And what you will see in the lessons that follow are how classroom teachers begin to use critical race theory connected to ethnic studies in a way to empower and to create social justice activists out of our students. Unquote. That's the goal. The goal of critical race theory is to create nice little Marxists out of your public school students. Listen, there is nothing innocuous about critical race theory. That's why I want this graphic up here. Critical race theory is an all-encompassing worldview, one that is steeped in cultural Marxism and that shares the same teleological ends as that which I quoted earlier from Paul Kengor, namely the takedown of the West and its Judeo-Christian bedrock. Thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it.